our first panel of the conference. The title of this panel is Little Platoons and Big Ideas, Conservatism, the Art of Connection. I'm going to come back to that in a minute and ask some questions of the title itself. But let me first of all introduce myself. My name is Ted McAllister. I'm a faculty member here at the School of Public Policy. And we're in keeping with the idea of a conversation, presumably a conversation with ideas and with arguments, and not overly tolerant. We will have a conversation with 6 of us in a few minutes that then will be broadened out to the rest of the audience. But it appears as if individualism is already a big theme in this discussion. And it is the case that in the history of American conservatism, that one of the great tensions of this movement has always been between community and individualism. And it's generally understood, at least by people on my side of the equation, that conservatism has talked about community a lot, but conservatism doesn't do community well. I'm going to go a little further and suggest that individualism, as it's properly understood, might go with democracy and despotism, but it's utterly incompatible with self-rule and liberty. So we have to figure out what we mean by individualism as opposed to what we may mean by self-rule or self-governance. And by the way, the term rugged individualism in its original meaning referred to self-ruling people, not individualists, in the way in which we use the word today. Individualism does not equate to self-reliance, but in fact is usually an antonym. I was thinking as I was preparing for this, just as I was looking at the name tags. Have you noticed how name tags are done now? The first name is bigger than the last name. Now, I thought back to my old teacher, Dewey Grantham, who was an old liberal Southern historian at Vanderbilt, who always referred to his students by their last names. And I finally asked why. He says because they come from families and they are representatives of those families, so I honor their families first. Well, inspired by this, I started my teaching career at Hillsdale, but there are a lot of Polish names. And so I did my best and finally gave up. And so now I refer to it. But it does say something that now we want to highlight our first names almost always over our last names. So to our title, which I see a great tension in. Little Platoons, of course, comes from Edmund Burke and suggests most of all, but not exclusively, family, which is to say natural institutions that come from that carry with them non-chosen obligations. For Burke, these natural institutions, these institutions that are defining of humans as such, in which we naturally find our being, craft each person. They form the person who is a member of those institutions and the intricacies of those different institutions. So on the one hand, we have this position of nature, a natural institution like the little platoons and family. On the other side, we have artifice, the art of connection. I don't quite know what we mean by connection here. It's not a word I would choose. Is it the same thing as association? It has too much of this resonance of that hideous word networking, which is to use and abuse people for your own purposes. But whatever it means, does it mean, can it be included to mean some thick associations? And is there an art to creating them? More specifically, is there an art, not something natural, to creating a community that's peculiarly American? Has America developed the habits, the culture of community? Or did we once have it? And if we once had it, have we lost it? Can it be taught? Or does it, in fact, emerge from the cultural resources of the people themselves? So with those framing questions, this is a panel that may go in many different directions, but essentially it raises the community question, the civil society questions, the relationship between nature and art. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists, and as I introduce each one, I've asked them to take a few minutes to react, to respond to the panel subject, to offer something that is the grist of the mill for our conversation. Following each of their comments, I will then allow them to engage in a conversation based upon how they've argued, and then we will open it up to a larger conversation, and that includes you. The first of our panelists is Jeremy Beer, who is the chairman of the board of the American Conservative, and has worked in the nonprofit sector since 2000. Prior to co-founding American Philanthropic in 2009, he was the vice president of publishing and information systems at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, where he served as the editor-in-chief of the Institute's award-winning press, ISI Books. Jeremy has worked with many philanthropic organizations and nonprofit clients, and is the author of many essays and journal articles and books. Jeremy.
Thanks, Ted. Thanks to you and to Rich and Pete and Pepperdine for inviting me to be part of this, which is so far the most depressing conference I've ever been part of. So it's great to be here. No, Dr. Brookhammer was fantastic. I've learned one thing so far, and that is I will never consent to follow her again. She never follow Dr. Brookhammer. She's amazing. This panel could obviously cover a tremendous amount of ground, so I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts as they relate to two of the core questions we were asked to think about as panelists. One is, what does a conservatism that stresses community look like? And the second is, how does conservatism lead in strengthening the core institutions of healthy communities? So on number one, I'll just offer these thoughts. Conservatism that stressed the ideal of community, it seems to me, and I liked how you defined it to us in an email, Ted, as, quote, those deeply personal and obligatory institutions and relationships, end quote, in the web of which nearly every human being has lived and located his or her identity until very recently. A conservatism of this kind might begin, I think, by perhaps, talking about community. Because obviously the concept of community is hardly missing from the Anglo-American conservative tradition. In many ways, it is constitutive of that tradition. Yet the strengthening or recreation of healthy, thick communities, while it is a philosophical priority for many conservative thinkers and writers, is not a priority within institutional conservatism. I reviewed the mission statements for this conference of the 10 biggest and most prestigious national conservative organizations I could think of, and to be fair, I excluded the libertarians. It's not fair to, they should be talking about community, right? Even our friend Will Ruger here, the virtue libertarians, we're not even going to make them talk about community. 0 of these organizations include the word community in their mission statements. Only a couple of them even gesture toward the concept with terms such as civil society or solidarity. I looked at the 10 largest conservative foundations, the funders. Fewer than half of them mention strengthening or serving communities as central to their charitable missions, and those of them that do say community usually mean a local community where the original donor was located or from. So if community is central to Anglo-American conservatism, why is it not at the core of conservative institutions? Is American conservatism in its institutional forms condemned to pursue its work within the conceptual framework of liberal individualism? And does any of that matter? Those are some questions I'd like to throw out there. Question number 2, if conservatives did want to lead in the effort to rebuild genuine, healthy communities, what could we do? And here's where Dr. Brookhammer has already put on the table the 3 key issues that seem to me emerge from recent articles and books describing the inner dynamic of contemporary community breakdown. Don't have to go into them because we just talked about them. Instability, loneliness, and meaninglessness. Everyone seems to agree, almost everyone, that a pervasive sense of instability, loneliness, and meaninglessness lie at the root of current pathologies like rising suicide rates, the opioid epidemic, record high depression diagnoses, the retreat from marriage, everything we just heard about. Well, each year, I write or review dozens and dozens of grant proposals, donor prospectuses, annual reports, brochures, and direct mail pieces produced by center-right organizations. Precious few talk about instability, loneliness, meaninglessness, or anything of that sort. Now, why is that? Is that because American conservatives have a fundamentally political rather than social orientation? Is it because American conservatism is mostly a form of liberalism? Is it because we are out to lunch and every bit is removed from non-coastal American communities as the left? Is it because we regard these issues as mere symptoms of a bigger problem? Those questions might be worth considering. Now, actually, among conservatives, the idea of stability has come up recently. And for conservatives, it seems, the working class is irrationally attached to the ideal. You may recall Kevin Williamson's National Review article from last year, castigating members of the white working class as losers, his word, for failing to have the gumption to uproot themselves, for failing to leave behind their families and communities and places they love in order to go where the jobs are. As tech mogul Gavin Newsom in the HBO show Silicon Valley, and if you're not watching that, you ought to be, asks a black North Carolina mayor when the mayor tells Gavin that he has lived in the same town his entire life. Your whole life? It's kind of weird, isn't it? Apparently many conservatives agree. In truth, if we cared, a lot could be done to address instability, loneliness, and meaninglessness. Conservatives could be identifying, generating, and getting behind thousands of locally adapted efforts to stabilize families and economies and engage the lonely and despairing. Conservatives could be trying to identify and then sharing with others models of small-scale local action to strengthen or rebuild communities across the nation. And these are the kinds of things that are happening now. Efforts to address the opioid epidemic in rural areas, initiatives to engage the burgeoning problem of lonely elderly, innovative scholarship and debt forgiveness programs aimed at keeping or luring talented youths back home. Things that are happening out there now that conservatives are not involved in. There's a need here for lots of social entrepreneurship as well as old-fashioned charity, and I just want to mention one such entrepreneur. His name is Sam May, and he is a left-leaning retiree who, having done very well in Silicon Valley, returned to his home state of Maine a few years ago. And like everyone else these days, Sam is a farm-to-fork sort of guy, a locavore foodie. But he's also a businessman, and it eventually came to his attention that small farmers and processors could not get loans. I'm getting slightly into Tim's territory here. They could not access the capital they needed to grow or sometimes even survive. He points out this would have been a problem a generation or two ago when we had things called local banks. You may remember this. The people who ran those banks lived in their communities. They had to make their money in those communities and thus built business models that necessarily included making loans to local small business owners. No more. The consolidation of the banking industry combined with a regulatory environment prejudice toward large institutions has made it all but impossible for the little guy to borrow money. Between 2008 and 2017, bank lending to large institutions rose by 35%. For small businesses during the same period, it went down by 15%. So Sam, along with a friend, created something called the Maine Harvest Credit Union, an old banking model that suits smaller communities exceptionally well. He thought he'd have no trouble borrowing the $1 or $2 million he needed, or actually getting given to him from philanthropic institutions, the $1 to $2 million he needed to capitalize the credit union, and for all various reasons, which I can go into if you're interested, and he was wrong. But what is of interest to me is, one, he never even thought of approaching conservative sources, which is telling for all sorts of reasons. And two, he believes strongly, as he put it to me in an email, that the future depends on us, quote, getting more local and more connected. Well, who here would disagree? But if that's the case, why aren't any conservatives doing what Sam is doing? Why isn't the Maine-based state policy network group behind him? Why don't we see our work as essentially consisting in the encouragement and empowerment of thousands of these kinds of grassroots endeavors? I'm genuinely curious and look forward to discussing. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy. Our next panelist is Timothy Carney. He's a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he works on economic competition, lobbying, I don't know if it's teaching cronyism, but examining cronyism, and political economy.
How to?
He is concurrently the commentary editor at the Washington Examiner. Most especially, Mr. Carney writes and comments on the ways in which well-connected special interests use big government to elude market forces and squash small competitors. In fact, exactly as Jeremy was suggesting. Tim?
Thank you. There's a million things I could talk about. This is my new favorite subject, even more than cronyism. But what I want to do is tell a story of how I came into this question of civil society. And me being a political journalist, as was mentioned, the story begins in Iowa. Me being an Irish Catholic, the story begins in a bar. It was watching a college football game where Iowa was in the national championship game. I went to Iowa City and watched it at a bar there. Now, it was mostly just college kids, and I'm old enough that I don't really want to hang out with college kids, so I gravitated towards these two faculty members there. Married couple, and she was from a city in Iowa called Orange City. And so I asked, I said, what sort of orange? Again, as an Irish Catholic, you hear the word orange, it gets you a little skeptical. In this case, there was a connection, and it had to do with being Dutch. And her name was Vander something, and I asked, I mean, are they really still Dutch? Because in New York, we have all these strong ethnicities, right? You're Irish or Italian. But in so much of the country, they don't. She said, oh yeah. She would march down the street in her clogs on the Tulip Festival past the windmills that are in the center of the town. It's like a Simpsons episode of Dutch people. And this interested me, and I went there right before the caucuses, and sure enough, I found something really interesting. Now, I'm going to talk about the election here. I'm talking about the primaries. I'm talking about when there were 17 Republicans on that stage. I'm not talking about the general, where it was Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. Everything I say about Donald Trump here is in the early primaries. Donald Trump, worst county in America was Sioux County, Iowa, where Orange City is, and where Dordt College, this is in the caucuses, his worst county in all the primaries and in the Iowa caucuses was that county. He got 15%. And then in my home state, Maryland, Trump won Maryland. He won my county, Montgomery County, which is supposed to be sort of this big, highly educated, wealthy place. But I went to the wealthiest municipality in the wealthiest region, in the wealthiest country in the history of the world. That's the village of Chevy Chase. We probably have some Chevy Chase villagers here. I went there. Trump again, 15%. Kasich demolished him. Then I went out to Utah. Trump again, 15% in the state of Utah. His worst places, there are 30 counties where he got less than 20%. Half of them are Mormon, the others are like those Dutch counties, and then the others are the elite counties, Fairfax County, Arlington, Alexandria, where you have 60% have it, college degrees or more. And so what did I make out of all this? The guy whose appeal was saying, the American dream is dead, his appeal didn't resonate in two types of places. One, these strong religious communities, whether they're Dutch Reformed or Mormon. Two, these elite places like Chevy Chase, Fairfax, college towns. How are they the same thing? As a political journalist, you want to have a cleaner narrative. And as a guy who studied philosophy undergrad, you want to see, is there one explanation for it? The one explanation is that they both of those wealthy elites and the religious conservatives have strong institutions of civil society. They have places where they go to find meaning, to find both a support network and a sense of purpose. To places where they can act out their destiny as political animals. They can flex their political muscles. And just a few more numbers on those early primaries. If you went once or more a week to church in the pre-Indiana primaries, 32% voted for Trump. If you never went to church, 62% voted for Trump. That doesn't show up on this is in the primaries, again, not in the general. This doesn't show up on religious observance. In fact, Trump voters were slightly more likely to say religion and their faith is very important to them. But do you go to church? Now, I tell this to some of my conservative friends who don't really like Trump, and they say, these are hypocrites. They say they're Christian, they don't go to church. That's not the right interpretation, I think. These people don't belong to a church community. Again, I hope later we'll get into theological discussions. I'm not equipped to do that. But it's broader than church. Church, I think, is the most important institution of civil society, is a way to look at it. Again, as Dr. Brohammer was suggesting. Social capital scores. Mike Lee's office put out another thing, kind of like the Penn State thing that Robert Putnam relied on. Each county has a certain score of social capital. How many bowling leagues are there? How many churches are there? How much do people vote? How much do people donate to charity? The 10 counties in Iowa with the highest social capital scores, one of them voted for Trump in the primaries. The bottom 10 counties, 8 of them voted for Trump in the primaries, and the other 2 he lost by less than 1 point. I spent, right after I was in Sioux County, I was down in Pottawatomie County where Council Bluffs is. I almost called it Council Tucky because that's what they call it there. It's a place, I saw Trump carry the day, and the people who voted for him in the Council Bluffs precinct there looked like almost that ragtag bunch that like wins the day in the movie, except they weren't a team. They all disappeared after the voting was done, and only 2 of them stuck around to watch the vote. And they were the only 2 people there who wouldn't talk to me as a journalist afterwards. But I found a couple of them in the bar afterwards, a couple of the Trump supporters, and they all told me they'd never been involved in politics because they thought politics was bogus. And that was how Trump carried the day. So, to move on to the other speakers, I just want to end with this note. That profound sense of alienation that comes from not having an attachment to a church or another sense of community, I think that made Trump's message of the American dream is dead really carry the day. And it carried over to a sense of political alienation that conservatism today isn't properly addressing. Because I think I'm a rugged individualist libertarian guy in a lot of ways, but I think the message that, well, you shouldn't bother with other people's business. The leave me alone coalition is a phrase my friend Grover Norquist often uses. And there's a lot of ways in which we do just want to be left alone, right? Don't tell us who to bake cakes for, and don't tell us what don't take our union dues to fund other things, or the 2 big conservative victories this week, right? But man is a political animal. He's made to not just determine his own life, but to shape the world around him. And if you don't have a parish where you get to start a new ministry or you get to start a new t-ball game, if your local government doesn't determine anything of importance, if you don't belong to a swim club where they need you, you're actually needed, then you're going to look for another level on which to carry out your political levels. That's how we got Occupy Wall Street and Bernie Sanders, a bunch of politically alienated liberals saying, well, if I'm not having a say, it must be the banks are killing me. And I think that's how you got people saying the American dream is dead. I'm supposed to. Subconsciously, they're saying, I'm supposed to be shaping the world around me. I don't have any power. Maybe I need a strong man to go in there and bust some heads. Thank you.
Thank you. Just as a note, Timothy has a piece out today in the Washington Examiner, Without Civil Society, There's No Civility, which I recommend to you. But he has this passage. He talks about these middle institutions following his argument that man is a political animal. I assume women as well. But you follow that, just to put it in the context of some things that Jeremy has said in other parts of this conversation, you reference local government, swim club, village public school. All of this is very local, right? And so there's something about your understanding, if I'm not mistaken, that I'd like us to tease out a bit more, that our political life cannot be simply an abstract voting individualist right, but has to be somehow connected to people we know, right, at some level.
Yep.
Is that true?
Yes.
Okay, and that middle institutions is an interesting phrase that we might want to come back to in the conversation. Elizabeth Corey is our next panelist. Elizabeth is an associate professor of political science at Baylor University, where she serves as the director of the honors program. Her writing has appeared in First Things, The Atlantic, The Chronicle of Higher Education, National Affairs, among other places. And she is also the co-editor of Radical Conservatism's book series at the University of Pennsylvania Press. Elizabeth.
Thank you. What I'd like to talk about briefly here today is something that I think will be taken up more extensively tomorrow, and that is, in a sense, the role of the universities in some of the splintering of community in the present day. But let me back up from that to just begin by talking about what I think to be the most essential parts of conservatism. And this is, we were talking before this panel about how we understand conservatism. I think it was Jeremy, maybe Jeremy and Ted, who said it has to do with beauty. And they commented on how strange that is in contemporary discourse to talk about beauty as having something to do with conservatism. But I agree that they're really right and onto something. So I understand the essence of conservatism to consist in two things. One is a disposition, which is a disposition not just to not be progressive, but to live in a sort of present that is not constantly disaffected, dissatisfied, and that can take pleasure and delight in the things that we have inherited and have before us. And it is, on that score, very much concerned with things like beauty. The essential action, I think, of a conservative is to preserve an inheritance, and those inheritances are many. They're intellectual, they're political, moral, and religious. And I don't have to tell this audience the degree to which those things are all being attacked at the moment. How do universities play a part in this? Well, it's been my experience, and I've taught at Baylor for now almost 16 years. Universities tend to breed a sort of dissatisfaction, a discontent, and a kind of tribalism that ironically seems to aim at building community around certain characteristics, demographic characteristics of various sorts, race, sexual identity, gender, and so on, but in fact issues in a kind of splintering of community insofar as it's very hard to be in a community with others who declare their difference from you. And this is related to what Dr. Brookhammer talked about in the last session, this notion of identity. And I know that this will be something we talk about at length at this conference. And I think it was she who said, we have very shallow definitions of identity now. But I think that's encouraged in a certain way by universities and the identity politics that is so rampant at universities. If our identity no longer consists in things like our family, our last name, or the church we're a part of, or the place we come from, then it is natural to me that one would start to find an identity in things like various grievances, various identity characteristics, race, so on. So as I've said, ironically, in trying to build a certain kind of community among people who share demographic characteristics, this has the effect of impeding a broader political community and splintering us off. Some of you all will be familiar with the notion of intersectionality, which is in a way a splintering of the most extreme kind, such that it's a measure of privilege and oppression, and the most oppressed have the most power to speak because they have the most demographic markers of oppression. And this is, of course, rampant at universities. This undermines real political community, I think, because what it instills is a fear of saying the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong time. You're constantly aware of what can be said and what cannot be said to various people based on characteristics, and this is an impediment to civility, and I'm sure we will talk about this more. And all this is undergirded by a notion of progressivism that is really baffled by the idea of conservatism as a preservation of an inheritance, of conservatism as a kind of enjoyment, as conservatism as a disposition. Because what universities are teaching is that the past is infected, the past is bad. Far from preserving this inheritance that we've inherited, it is a kind of tearing down of it. I mean, this is old hat, you all know all this, but it's really quite true. So the idea that you would want to preserve the Western tradition is really anathema. I fear, though, that also the American project that we're going to talk about here today is being attacked a bit from the right, too. Many of you all will be familiar with the work of the sort of end of liberalism conservatives. I think our job here this weekend or this week is to think about how can we find a sort of moderate position between the identity politics of the left and the giving up of the liberal tradition on the right, or at least the gestures in that way that many of us are seeing who read these sorts of things. Let me just take up one question briefly that Jeremy raised a minute ago, and he said, what is it, he didn't say this, but it's the question I took from what he said, what does it take to engage the lonely and the disaffected? And it seems to me that there's so much talk about diversity now, but it seems to me that the real diversity that nobody wants to talk about is the relationship between classes, between the educated and the uneducated. Obviously, it's the thesis of Charles Murray's coming apart. But that's a real diversity, and that is a kind of diversity that to bridge it is very difficult. Because what you find when you are entering into relationships with people of different classes, of different levels of education, is they don't act the way you expect them to, and oftentimes they don't act the way you wish they would. So I think that's a crucial question. How is it that we of the educated classes ought to engage the people who are not of the educated classes? And who are the people, especially the men, who are committing suicide at these very high rates? How do we go about doing that? And I have some ideas about it, but I hope that we'll take this up later.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Daniel Garza, who has a rather variety of career postings. He began as his public service career as a staff assistant to U.S. Congressman Richard Hastings. He later became a councilman in the city. Is this Toppenish?
Toppenish, Washington.
Toppenish, Washington.
Well, not a lot of people get that.
In 1996, he joined the Bush administration to serve as the deputy director of external and intergovernmental affairs in the office of the secretary at the Department of Interior. Man, that's a long title.
Longer the title, the less you do, apparently.
And he's been in media, including working with Univision, where he hosts and co-produced Agenda Washington, a weekly Spanish language news talk show covering issues impacting the U.S. Hispanic community. Daniel.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today. So I run the Libre Initiative, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that does engagement, outreach with the Latino community across the country, and we advance the principles of economic freedom, advance a free society. So what we're talking about here today, connectivity, is very real to me. I don't practice in theory. I actually have to be very practical about this, what we're talking about today, and how we connect with Latinos across the country to advance these principles of a free society, well-being and prosperity, to make them understand that Latinos need the free market. And frankly, the free market needs Latinos. We are having to defend the free market in America today, which is astonishing. So I took it upon myself to, in launching this effort, to really examine my own personal experience and my observation. Experiences of my parents growing up a farm worker who would travel from California to Central Valley picking grapes, to the state of Washington picking apples, pears, peaches, and the Panhandle in Nebraska hoeing sugar beets. We talked about a predisposition. I was hooked on the firing line. That's how I got involved in politics. Once I saw Bill Buckley, I was in. But it came with a predisposition. It's not like he converted me or he persuaded me. I was aligned. And what's interesting is that today even, if you look at the most recent NBC Marist poll and the Pew Hispanic poll, more Latinos self-identify as conservative than they do as either moderates or liberals. So there already is an alignment. And when I say conservatives, I'm talking both conservative, libertarian, free market, limited government, in that range. There already is an alignment. But what had happened was Latinos in general, for the longest time, for decades even, were on the outside looking in when it came to our American institutions, connecting to mainstream America. And when I talk about on the outside looking in, United Farm Workers Union, the early Latino nonprofits had to march, protest, raise the fist, do school walkouts. It was the only way they could be heard. Not to condone it, but when you're on the outside looking in, you get desperate. And today, young Latinos especially, are on the inside looking out. Very active, very sophisticated, very knowledgeable about the American process and connecting. But where I think the biggest mistakes that we made on the conservative, free market, limited government, libertarian side, conservatarian, let's say, is that we didn't engage with minority communities. We didn't do the investments that we needed to do. We didn't develop the relationships that we needed to do. It was a one-sided conversation that was being done by the left. They were persuading Latinos to join their ranks, their institutions, to connect with them. I remember my dad telling me once that he was invited to a United Farm Workers Union meeting, a recruitment meeting, because it was part of a crew that was picking grapes in Central Valley of California at the time, living in Madera, California. I myself was born in Dinuba. And the only reason Dad said that he didn't join was because they were taking a vote at the time. And the vote was, when we march outside in the parades, should we do it under the banner of the Virgen de Guadalupe? My dad was a recently converted evangelical, evangelico. And there was no way he was going to march under a Catholic symbol. So him and his uncle, or my uncles and his cousins, bailed out of that meeting. But what's interesting is that they were never approached by anybody on the conservative free market side, ever. If it wasn't for Bill Buckley, I'd probably be doing something else right now, honestly. So it's fascinating when we talk about where we're at right now as a movement. The Libre Initiative, the organization that I'm a president of, is really a byproduct or a product of the indifference of conservatives to Latinos. When I was working at the White House for George W. Bush at the Office of Public Liaison, it was my job to advance the agenda of the president to the Latino community. And it was hard, difficult, challenging to find aligned Latino organizations that operated at a national scale. They were almost non-existent, to be honest with you. And so that created the urgency for us to do that. But the thing that you find out really quick, and I'll start wrapping up here, in driving and unleashing this effort that we were going to operate on a national scale in several states, is that obviously just the logistics is almost impossible. But it's not just that you have to be a public policy advocacy organization, because the need is so great in the Latino community, as a community. One thing is to talk about the free markets and the virtues of a limited government to the Latino community, and to persuade them on these issues. But how about 1/3 of Latinos who do not have a high school diploma, adults? In some states, 50% of us don't have a driver's license. 33% of us only speak Spanish. These are major barriers to opportunity, to accessing the free market. They are not well positioned in the market to enjoy the benefits of a limited government. And so what we did was actually launched efforts where we have classes where thousands of Latinos are learning English. Thousands, literally thousands of Latinos have gotten their driver's license through the expert training that we're providing. GED courses, helping them with their citizenship, to remove those barriers, and then the free market becomes real. Then they connect, and it's a real platform. And the result has been that we've recruited thousands and thousands of Latinos, young Latinos even, from churches, from universities, from Chamber of Commerces, who now help us to canvass homes, to make the phone calls that we need in support of tax cuts, deregulation, against the minimum wage, for school choice, for religious liberty, for freedom of expression, and on and on and on and on. Latinos themselves now mobilized. And so I'm looking forward to getting into more of the discussion, because I can go on. But
Thank you. I noticed that both you and Elizabeth have referenced dispositions, and that suggests to me there's something about what it is that we want. Is there something that we're yearning for, wanting? Daniel, your comments actually suggested toward the end that there's a challenge in how we empower people to be participants in a self-governing society.
yeah, so one thing is to do the outreach, to convert people over, to actually do the hard work of cutting past the noise and getting the message to the people. Ronald Reagan said freedom doesn't pass on through the blood. It passes on from one generation to the next. It has to be communicated. And we just assume that our ideas sell themselves to the Latino community. To some it does, but to the vast majority, they never hear of it. Latinos have not rejected market principles. They just haven't heard them. And another thing is to engage those that are already aligned, that are already predisposed, to mobilize them on these issues. Ask. That's what you have to do. You have to ask. You have to go into their communities. I find it fascinating that in Texas, 10 million Latinos in Texas out of 30 million Texans. and there's not one statewide elected Democrat. It's the same percentage here in California of Latinos, but there isn't one statewide elected Republican. You got to do the hard work. You have to engage. Cornyn won the Latino vote. And I'll end with this as a little crown jewel. In 2014, a black Republican challenger took out a Democrat Latino incumbent in District 23, 75% Hispanic district. Think about that. It's not a vote that's baked in, and it's not a thought that's baked in ideologically. They can be outreached to and engaged.
Yeah, our final panelist is Joshua Mitchell, who comes to us from Georgetown University, where he's a professor of political theory. His research interest lies in the relationship between political thought and theology in the West. His most recent book, Tocqueville in Arabia, Dilemmas in a Democratic Age, was published by the University Chicago Press in 2013. One thing that's added here that I find intriguing is that he is an avid conservationist working to restore his small forest on the eastern shore. Jeremy will like that. And, I don't know if you'll like this or not, working to develop the next generation of solar electric sailboats, which has got to be, I didn't know there was a first generation. Josh.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I do want to thank Pete and Rich for having me be affiliated with this project. If it wasn't apparent from Pete's original comments, I think Pepperdine is the only place in the country where we're paying attention to the facts on the ground of human experience and then trying to move to policy from that. It's a deeply Tocquevillian way of proceeding, and what I want to do here is ask you to indulge me for a few minutes, take a 40,000-foot view about the larger way in which we're thinking about our problems today. So I'm going to do kind of political theory, talk very briefly on Alexis de Tocqueville, but I'm going to be very clear, I don't think that's enough. I think what we have to do is move back and forth between ideas and policy, and that's the way we move forward. We are in the midst of a crisis, but I don't think populism is the right name for it. Our crisis is a crisis of homelessness. Now, there's an advantage, I think, to using the term populism because it sets up a binary that we're very familiar with and comfortable with, and that is kind of universalist aspirations, cosmopolitan frame mind, full cultural integration around the globe. And the way this gets set up in our minds is, well, there's those people, the cosmopolitans, and then there's all the others who are parochial, small-minded, etc. And I think it's a very dangerous opposition. It's also very unhealthy for thinking because I don't think it's adequate. So what I want to do is provide an alternative to this view. And it points in the direction of a whole new vocabulary, not the language of parochialism and populism, but rather the language of home and homelessness, which is why I think what's happening here is so important. It's really trying to explore a whole new set of categories that we can use to understand our situation, and most importantly, to respond to the universalists who can only see, in an attempt to turn away from cosmopolitanism, a kind of parochial, xenophobic impulse. Is that impulse there? Of course it's there. But there is a healthy intermediate position which I want to trace out. I think we have to think through the situation we're in, not in terms of this binary opposition between universalists and parochial. One of the things that fascinates me coming from Washington is that when it became clear that there were rumblings in the political landscape, immediately members of both parties said, oh yes, it's a populism problem. Well, Democrats and Republicans have agreed on nothing for a generation, and suddenly they're agreeing that, yes, we've got this populism problem. I think this is a very serious issue. Tocqueville, of course, comes to America, Alexis de Tocqueville comes to America and writes Democracy in America precisely at the so-called populist moment in the 1830s with Andrew Jackson. He nowhere mentions populism or anything like it, but he does see that there's a profound American problem. And my argument is that we actually have to go back and understand him very deeply, this book, Democracy in America, because I think he gives us the categories that we need, and he is the only philosopher, in my view, in the 19th century, probably the 20th too, who understood this profound problem of homelessness. In one of his letters, he writes, the profound saying, "It is not good for man to be alone," applies to me especially. And the whole of Democracy in America can be seen as a philosophical rumination on the problem of homelessness and loneliness and isolation. That whole book is a rumination on this problem. I should add also, and I don't see her, the young lady who was talking about mental depression as a mental illness. I tell my students that if you read Tocqueville very closely, what you discover is that he thought, I'll say this as boldly as I can, that the natural condition of human beings is bipolar disorder. That is to say, the natural disposition of human beings is to oscillate back and forth between brooding withdrawal and a kind of frenzied activity in the world. And the whole of his analysis in Democracy in America is an attempt to show that it's only through these mediating institutions that we can attenuate this problem. So whereas we want to make this a brain chemistry problem, I think what Tocqueville saw in the 19th century is it's not a brain chemistry problem. He said in America you're going to have more madness than in any place else around the world. Why? Because we've cut the links between persons and we've become increasingly lonely. So I think we do need to follow Tocqueville. And let me just now develop this just in a few more minutes here. He was the first one, I think, to fully develop the idea that globalism is the great temptation of the democratic age. Now, why? And we can give economic arguments for it, and they're powerful economic arguments. But what he saw was that the real reason why we get to this condition of cosmopolitan life was that we break the links between everybody. So he says aristocracy links everybody from peasant to king in one long chain. Democracy breaks the chain and frees each link. Thus, not only does democracy make men forget their ancestors, our inheritance, as Elizabeth would say, but also clouds their view of their descendants and isolates them from their contemporaries. Every man is forever thrown back on himself alone, and there is a danger that he may be shut up in the solitude of his own heart. So what he's fascinated by is the thoughts that come naturally into people's imagination in the democratic age. And these are the thoughts that we all have. And part of the reason I think it's important to start from experience is we want to say, well, no, there's a politics out there, and we need to address the politics. I think what Tocqueville says is, why don't we start with this thing called democratic experience, ask what it looks like, and see what politics might follow from that. So his view was that once this breaking of the links occurs, there are lots of things that become self-evident. For example, we think in terms of problems and solutions. Right? We're always talking about problems and solutions. But Tocqueville said in the aristocratic age, before the democratic age, we thought in terms of amelioration, making things slightly less bad. But in the democratic age, we think that we can solve all the grand problems. We can have a grand unified world that we can, in fact, save the planet. And Tocqueville would say, no, this is something only the democratic mind can come up with. Furthermore, he says, and I think this is so important for us to think about today, he says, once you break all the links, unity becomes an obsession. Real differences between men and women, between peoples, between states, become psychologically unbearable. Where is the citizen, Tocqueville wondered, who is prepared to live in the contrary, in this kind of non-parsimonious world where things don't always fit, where what we conclude with respect to family isn't going to fit with what we conclude with respect to politics and economics. And he thought the real challenge of the democratic age was to be able to live with this world that doesn't quite fit together. And it's only through these mediating institutions that we can diminish this sense of non-parsimoniousness. But he saw that our temptation is to move away from all these particular things because we're so frightened, and we were asking the question, why does this happen? It's because we don't want risk. We don't want any contradictions. And so we move higher and higher up to the level of universals. This is the great temptation. So think about it. How many of us are religious versus how many of us are spiritual? We hear this. I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. We don't want to be parents, we don't want to be fathers and mothers. We want to be co-parents. We're always moving up a level because it's difficult to engage at the really concrete level where real life actually exists. So we're always being drawn up to this higher level. And yet Tocqueville thought that we couldn't do this, that finally human beings need to have a home. But it's not just that he understood this globalist, universalist disposition. I think what he gets, it's so incredibly important for us, is that he understood the co-relationship between this universalist phenomenon and life becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. So these two things go together. So in my language, I say the phenomena that we're wrestling with today is the phenomenon of globalism and identity politics. These two things go together. Our identities become smaller and smaller and smaller. And what Tocqueville worried about was that life would become more and more bifurcated, and that we would live in our experience in two different places. On the one hand, and now I'll use another term that I give, through our selfie selves. Okay. And on the other hand, through what I call management society. And so what he sees is that we're going to create a world, he sees this in 1835, of what I call management society and selfie man. Okay. And what's curious about this is that it, by the way, it's this being completely out of balance, right? Too small and too big. What's curious about this is we come to think of ourselves in the following way. I'll use the exact quote. We come to think of ourselves as greater than kings and less than men. And what does that mean? We're greater than kings in that we all have our Facebook pages. I don't, by the way. I teach a lecture called Facebook is Death. And I'm quite serious about this. But we are greater than kings on our Facebook pages because we take pictures of ourselves, and the background becomes important because we're in it. The world becomes important because of the picture we take of us in it. This is unbelievable. We're greater than kings. On the other hand, we're less than men in that any decision that has to be made, we can't do. We have to hand up to the global managers. So if we have an environmental crisis, if Trump doesn't sign the Paris Accords, it means the planet is dead. This is ludicrous because only the global managers could save us. This is a remarkable phenomenon, this psychological split where we feel ourselves to be greater than men, greater than kings, and less than men. This is the experiential root of the problem. And so Tocqueville asks the question, given the fact that life is going to become much more bifurcated, what do we do? And his argument is, the only thing we can possibly do is build the world together in the mediating institutions, in face-to-face relations. That's the only thing that can pull us out of ourselves and give us a kind of an understanding of the proportionality, the real proportionality of human life. And if we don't have these face-to-face associations where we build a world together, we lose all sense of proportion, and so we become greater than kings and less than men. So everything that he writes about these face-to-face associations, all the literature on civic associations which copies him, Putnam, the rest, none of them understand that this is all written, Tocqueville writes all this, in the context of this deep bifurcation that he sees us developing as we march through the democratic age. And my argument is this is exactly what's happened, certainly since 1989. We have made a wager that we can build a world around global managers and selfie society. It cannot work. We need palpable human existence and human connections. And that's, if we don't have those, we get all the pathologies that Dr. Borgeheimer pointed out and the ones that we all know in our own lives. And the only antidote is to build a world face to face. Last thing, why do we do this? Why do we live in these two separate places? Because in both places there's no risk. You can defriend somebody and you can hand off the problem to global managers. And so the only way that we can redeem this bifurcated world that gives nobody any satisfaction is to take the risk. It's the threshold point you were making at the outset. We have to take the risk. But the experiential evidence that we're unwilling to take a risk, and I'll end with this, is to be found even in the way that we communicate with our friends. We text message them to see if we can make a call to them. What does that mean? It means that we're afraid to risk real-time engagement. So what I'm trying to say is that Tocqueville peered into the future, but also peered into the inner workings of the democratic mind. And he saw all these pathologies, and so I strongly recommend that we think very deeply about this. Go back and read the book, but also pay attention to human experience. All the signs that he saw in 1835 are playing themselves out right now. This is why we must avoid the language of populism and the opposition between universalism and parochialism. The problem is homelessness. I'll stop with that.
Thank you so much. Before we get into the Q&A, I want to put a few things in the air that the panelists may or may not choose to pick up, and then I'm going to ask how they want to engage with each other, if they want to challenge or respond to specific comments. But a couple of things that have struck me, going back to Jeremy's discussion of stability, which sort of adds an element to it. What is it that makes possible stability? He made one reference to economics, but I think we have not talked enough, and we probably will not be able to talk enough about work, labor, and what work does for people, not just their ability to take care of themselves and their family, which is crucially important, but to what degree does it give them a place in the world, a sense of identity, a sense of a role to play. I think that's a very important question to ask. And what should society offer people in terms of opportunities to have meaningful labor? And how do we do that? What policies might make that possible? Elizabeth raised a whole set of questions that I think about taking delight in what we have inherited. And I kept thinking about a community that is made possible by a community of memory, often located in a particular place that you can inhabit in a fair, you're sort of born into it in a comfortable set of expectations that you inherit and engage with. And that's a very important form of community. And I think that in some ways it's the hardest one for us to have today. But there's another one that Americans have been particularly good at, which is that ability to create place out of space, to turn strangers into neighbors. I come originally from Oklahoma City. My grandmother was born in the territory of Oklahoma, and her mother was in Oklahoma City literally hours after it was established, or actually not established, but people had settled themselves there. And within a week, they had civic institutions. All these strangers didn't know each other at the land run. They created place, the institutions of place that worked very well. So there's something, and Tocqueville, of course, has a great deal to say about our ability as Americans, the habits of turning strangers into neighbors, and not depending upon what is inherited, but actually creating something with each other. And those can stand in tension with each other, but they're both rather about how do we create a place where we belong, where we have a sense of attachment that's meaningful to us. And then the question of dispositions and the empowering of people to be able to be self-governing people, to participate in the economy in ways that they can be a part, not of a self-governing political unit, perhaps, but a self-governing neighborhood or self-governing society. And what do we do to empower people so that they can engage in the society in that way? Okay, I asked the panelists if they want to engage any of these elements, or if they want to respond to any of the particular ideas that were raised earlier.
Well, I'd like to pipe up on the work question, and I imagine this will be discussed more throughout the week, but man is made for work is another thing I would say. And again, I'm making men, women, human race, making broad statements that are maybe widely accepted in this room about being political animal and made for work, but are not widely accepted throughout the U.S. Barack Obama actually did acknowledge it on stage with my boss at AEI, Arthur Brooks, and I was glad because I have a lot of socialist friends who think, ironically, you would think that Marxists would like work, but no, they think that work is just something to be liberated from, and a lot of libertarian friends who think that. So I would say that reinforcing the idea that we need to work, and that could be staying at home with children, that could be volunteering at your local swim club, but that we as human beings need to work is something that conservatives need to do more of a better job of doing. And where it gets really tricky, though, has been the conservative and Republican antagonism towards labor unions. Because the fact is that highly educated white-collar people work, and your boss and these other people, it can really form an institution of civil society. But for blue-collar work today, increasingly is deinstitutionalized. And if you're working for Uber, you don't have a workplace. If your boss is making your hours and all these other things, if it's irregular, it's not that. And so some idea of labor unions that's not this antisocial idea that came out of the Industrial Revolution and then sort of Anglo-American labor unions, but some other idea of labor unions needs to be part of the conservative project, where they are an institution of civil society that serves this role, not just to negotiate better wages, but to serve all these roles you're talking about. That's a challenge of a conservatism of connection.
Josh.
Just a very quick footnote, adding to what you're saying. And I think the language needs to be retooled. So we can talk in terms of guilds and apprenticeships. Mm-hmm. I think we need to retool the language, because the language of the labor union has been so tainted by its connection to communism. But it's true that in fact we have to build these units through which we learn to pass on knowledge about a trade to next generation. So I think we need to adopt this new language where the union language no longer works.
I suppose a big part of what makes work tolerable is that it can be meaningful. And if it's meaningful, it can confer upon you an identity. But if your jobs might change tomorrow or be outsourced to Pakistan or wherever, how can you build an identity around your work, right? This might be part of the answer to why identities are so shallow now as it's come apart. Another thing on that topic that's come out of what some of what's been said here, Elizabeth touched on this, the problem of shallow identities. You know, the free market is almost as good at generating identity options as it is espresso makers or craft beer choices. You know, in fact, our identities now often center around our consumer choices more than anything, right? And it seems to me this problem of shallow identities is because our identities now must be chosen. An identity conferred upon you is an intolerable constraint on your freedom, including your gender. Could be something different tomorrow. And so if you choose, if our identities are something we choose, they are necessarily going to be shallower than an identity in which you're inducted into, that's conferred upon you, given by somebody else. And this is a problem. We need to make sure we bring this out, this tension between kind of a market, the tutelary function of the market, or at least an ideology of the free market.
Jeremy, are we fated to have to choose to have a non-chosen identity?
No, this is the tragedy. I don't know. That's a
Because,
question.
I mean,
I don't know how you get back.
escape that
I don't
if
know.
we have this obligation to
Indeed.
choose?
Indeed. I speak of tragedy, Ted, not solution.
Daniel, do you have something?
Yeah, this notion of work and the value of work and what it does to human dignity, I think is a real critical topic. But what's also important is why you work and where is that work getting you to, and is there opportunity for advancement in work, right? Are you moving towards something bigger and better in your life? And you know, Americans have always been about getting a square deal, that they had equal opportunity. And unfortunately, sometimes getting that equal opportunity doesn't come equal when you have to face barriers that nobody else faces. And sometimes government itself imposes those barriers in over certification, over licensing, you know, these kind of things, so that you're working but you're getting nowhere. And I think there's this I've always found it, entre parentheses, let me say, I've always found it fascinating that Puerto Ricans in the island have an 86, 87% turnout rate for voting. There's a sense of ownership in the island, that they're working a shared struggle, a shared fight, that they're in this together. But Puerto Ricans in Orlando or everywhere else, I think it's under 50%. Wow. There's no sense of ownership. There's this disenfranchisement. There's no sense of equal opportunity. So you know, where do we fit in removing those barriers as a conservative movement? I think is a critical question that we have to address as well. Because it's just not about getting out there and talking louder than the other guy about what I believe and what my principles are, but actually doing the hard work of, you know, getting to the business of removing these barriers that are crippling people and not giving them a fair shot.
I wonder if I could get you to respond to particularly Josh, I think, but others have made similar comments about what I'll call that middle space between the abstract global idea and the private, very private life. To what degree how can we reclaim a middle ground in which in the label of the panel, the title of the panel, the art of connection or the art of association, might actually be practiced? I mean, I think at least what I heard is correct. Most of you, all of you, suggest that the art of association or connection can't be done at the national level. It somehow has to be at a different level, preferably a local level. How do you find a way of creating the opportunity for those connections to be, for people to actually practice that art of association? What do you do to get there?
Well, Tocqueville famously says the Americans vote once every 4 years, think themselves free, and fall back into servitude. And what he meant by that was that we think that the test of democracy is voting, and this is, I think, to David's point. The test of democracy is not voting. Voting is the resume. It's the final result of democracy. And so you get high participation rates when you have a share in it. So voting is the after effect of the long labor. And so let me tie this, keep going, but tie this into the observation about the shallowness of identity. I'm a little nervous about the term identity. We can talk about that maybe tomorrow. But nevertheless, Tocqueville says, in America, ideas are kind of mental dust. And I think you can drift everywhere. And you can also say persons are a kind of mental dust. There is no personhood for Tocqueville unless we gather together face to face. That's when we become people, right? We're simply imagining until we get into real life conversations with people. So the political project has to be one in which we recognize the importance of federalism. There I come to it. There's the political point. Because unless we're pushing in the direction of federalism, we're not solving this problem. And by federalism, I mean the decentralization of power, insofar as that's possible. This is not the state is an evil thing. I'm not going to say that. But you always want to have as many possible opportunities for people to work together. Now that's something that we can push for, but I want to be very clear. The real problem here, it's not a political problem. It is not a political problem. The real problem is an experiential one, which is that you and I have become comfortable with this bifurcated existence, and we don't want to take risks. We don't need the federal government to come and help us. We need to decide whether you and I are going to actually make the phone call as opposed to do the text message. I'm quite serious about this. This comes first. The politics will follow from that. But we would be, I think, timid. We'd be too timid to say, well, we'll wait for the political program and then we'll do this. No. We can begin to address this afternoon, but it has to involve a change in our own heads, which comes as a basis of our conclusion that living this way, while it presents all sorts of temptations and promises, is killing us.
And I want to pipe in on that. I'm writing a book on this topic, and I say that not just in the hopes that all of you will buy the book when it comes out from HarperCollins in February.
The title being?
What? Temporarily it's Abandoned America. Or it might be Alienated America, or I'm actually thinking today of Disconnectedness in America, riffing off of Tocqueville. But I mentioned the book for two reasons. One, the first time I wrote a book, somebody said, there's no chapter presenting solutions. So then the second time I wrote a book, I had a chapter with all these solutions. And I went back and looked at it years later, and I think I disagree with 90% of the solutions. Conservatives were not great at solutions. So this time, I have a chapter presenting solutions, but it's kind of, the solution is go to church. Start a t-ball team in your neighborhood. It's not that satisfying big, here's the policy. There is one, hey, government, stop cracking down on institutions of civil society. But I mentioned it for a second reason. It's crazy that I did this. While I have 2 jobs and 6 kids and was writing a book, I did more activity in my community than ever before, because I was about halfway into this book when somebody from my parish called me and said, hey, your daughter's playing on this kindergarten girls basketball team and there's no coach. Will you coach? And I was about to respond, no, I'm too busy writing a book about the importance of civil society in local communities. And I deleted the email and I said, yes, I will. And I'll tell you, talk about feeling needed. All these parents, it's kindergartners and it's Montgomery County, so they're sort of helicopterish. So they all have to come to every practice. But the good side of that is after every practice, almost every one of them came up to me and said, thank you for doing this. So then in the spring, I actually talked another guy into starting a t-ball team so that I could run like a parish picnic around it as this sort of thing. And I'm realizing this is more important than the book I'm writing, except to the degree that the book guilted me into doing this. But guess what? That's not a public policy. I mean, saying go to church is not that, isn't going to change a lot except for the people. So, I mean, again, I come back to we're conservatives and we're not that good at solutions, maybe.
Can I speak to that?
Sure,
you know, one thing that strikes me about Josh's polarity there is that there really does need to be a middle ground, and there obviously are civil institutions that can be that for us, but there's also the very humble institutions of family and neighborhood, you know, and the placeness. Because a certain strand of conservatism is very good at talking about placeness and placeness, the place we live and the importance of that place. But I think what that requires is a kind of tempering of our own desires and even of the goods we see as worthy of pursuing. And I think about a neighborhood as an example of this. I live in a city neighborhood where the people around the block from me are very different from me. And it would be very nice for me to say, well, you know, we all get along beautifully and we have a neighborly relationship and all is well. But the truth is they're really hard to live with sometimes. They have roosters that crow at all hours of the night, and there's nothing I can do about that. Yeah. Things like this crop up when you are living with people who are quite different from you, and you must either suffer it or be patient or go and talk to them, which is, as we've just been talking about, kind of awkward at times. And nevertheless, I think it's necessary if we're going to engage, you know, call them on the phone and actually say, you know, instead of having the police come out, do this for yourself. The other ways in which I think, I mean, the family, as we all know, is a wonderful training ground for a kind of patience, because there it's sameness. We all come from the same place. We understand each other so very well. And yet there's a kind of forbearance that's often called for in relating to our family members. So these very humble institutions of family and neighborhood are a kind of training ground for civil society.
Josh?
I praise democracy not for what it does, but for what it causes to be done. That's Tocqueville. And what he's saying is, local government is terribly inefficient. Neighborhood associations are terribly inefficient. But what they cause to be done is to draw us out of ourselves. And the biggest problem that we have, and Tocqueville saw this, was the problem of the imagination, you know, the imagined other. So I'm the president of my homeowners association, and believe me, our politics are completely different. And we come to the homeowners meetings and we're thinking, oh my goodness, well that person is this and that person. And then we have to work and solve a problem. And you walk out of there and you think, wow, they're not that bad. And the point is, if we're not forced into opportunities where we have to actually deal with people who are different, then it just gets terribly polarized and you get what we have today. Right? So national politics is not the way we're going to depolarize America. We're going to depolarize it by you and I reaching out to our neighbors and realizing they're not as bad as we thought.
Well, before I open it up to the audience to engage and question, I want to push back a little bit on some of that. I don't know how much that engagement will work because I wonder about structural elements more than we've talked, than our conversation has led us to believe are important, from the ways in which economic globalization have made meaningful stable local work difficult, to the way in which the Republican establishment in the 70s and 80s decided to take political power while leaving cultural institutions to be taken over by others, including the university, which has had in the past the primary obligation of handing down culture and handing down the great patrimony to the next generation, so that their inheritance is something they can actually take possession of. That's not what they do anymore, and who's to blame for that? Well, partly the Republican Party and the conservative movement that let it happen. Because we were too interested in a set of slogans about political power and economic freedom and not focus enough upon these questions. And that means that the institutional structures that are ubiquitous in our society are not ours. They're not preaching our message. And so coaching T-ball might be a very good thing to do. It is not sufficient, I think, to the answer to all our questions. And finally, there's one thing we have to come to grips with with regard to the art of association and connection that I don't think we're willing to. Tocqueville's description of township freedom is extremely important. The idea of township freedom is that political freedom is higher and greater than individual freedom. And that there's something jealous, that we have a jealous regard for our ability to work together to create our town in our own idiosyncratic way. It takes on a form that's different from the town down the way. And the only way that works is if the state and the federal government and the town down the way doesn't get in the way with how we do it. That means you can't get in the way of the way they do it. And anytime you want to talk about the importance of that middle ground that allows institutions to be built, it means you have to put that into tension with the ideals of justice, which are almost always universal and coercive. And if you take Book 5 of the Republic, not particularly laudable. Most of us think they are laudable. Okay, let's open it up to questions. You can answer that in the midst of the questions. Can we get the microphone to somebody, then I can call upon them. I was told very explicitly, do not call upon somebody if they don't have the microphone. Yes.
Thank you so much.
What's your name?
Brett Gold. I'm thinking the sanctity of language and words has been demeaned. And second only to the Bible, conservatism and capitalism are the greatest product ever bequeathed to humanity. But we have a promotion problem, a marketing problem, a branding problem. These are words with no passion, no emotion, no blood, no humor. Words like progressive and liberal, which in fact we are, not the other side, it move people. And somehow we have to get this passion. Trump, he's the embodiment of blood and passion and emotion and love and energy and power and life and guts. And he's the first guy to move into the White House, and it's a move down. When he gets on his Air Force One, compared to what he was flying. And so somehow, how do we rebrand ourselves and resell ourselves? Because we've got the merchandise, but we're just not selling it.
That's right.
Josh.
Well, so I think, as I've been trying to get at, we're at a very profound moment where experience exceeds the language that we've had. We know that the terms that we've been using aren't working. And I think this is great, because now we're going to have to really think beyond the categories. You mentioned Plato's Republic. Well, the passing shadow, as we say, yes, that's what this is. No, we're in a new stage here. And on the left, just quickly before I come to conservatives, on the left, I will say from teaching my students at Georgetown, I think they know that the progressive identity politics, which we'll talk about tomorrow, it's dead. They know it's dead. They're going to keep voicing it, but they know it's dead. On the right, my argument has been that conservatism was held together by opposition to progressivism at home and opposition to communism abroad. But if you put Burke together with Thomas Aquinas, together with Calvin, the evangelicals, together with Hayek, no, they have nothing to talk about. And so my argument these days is the way forward for the conservatives, and I'm even nervous about the term, I use the following formula. You can't get to Burke through Burke, but you can get to Burke through Tocqueville, by which I mean that Tocqueville is the grand unifying vision, because he saw what was happening. He said, I've tried to see further than the parties. The parties busied themselves with tomorrow. I've tried to see the whole of the future. That's the last sentence of the author's introduction. And that you can get to this idea of the little platoons only if you accept the fact that equality is here. This produces middle class anxiety. From there, you can get to defenses of market commerce because everybody's fearful they're falling. There is a way to produce a comprehensive vision, but my argument is the old terms that we've used that held together the conservative movement, the fusionism, over the last 50 years is over, full stop. And so too the left, the identity politics is over, full stop. And I think we have a profound opportunity to rethink this, but we're going to have to go back and do some reading and do some thinking. We can't reinvent the wheel. We have to look back and find the resources from the people who saw this happening 150 years ago.
We have the wheel. We have to sell it.
No, I mean, I think that idea that we have the wheel and we have to sell it is can become an excuse for laziness. And I live in Washington, where I see a lot of the intellectual laziness. You know it when you see the word Reagan, okay? I remember Reagan, but Ronald Reagan's inauguration was what? It was 38 years ago, 37 years ago. If you go back in time before that, I think Truman was the president. So you didn't have Reagan talking about how, we needed to be, so you get the point. So I do think that things are changing. Technology has changed the way humans interact, and there's new problems. There's old problems. The alienation is as old as the Republic, as Tocqueville shows us. But I also think that, as far as your question about selling it, the idea that you need to be connected to another person in a deep and intimate way, striving for, and to other people through institutions, striving for a higher good, is only objectionable for the most part to a lot of ideologues. And it's really can have appeal, especially to young people. Hey, do you know why college was the best time of your life? It's because you had institutions, shared purposes, where you were really connected to other people. There's another way to do this, and it's not going to be the life of Julia that Barack Obama is offering you. It's going to be through institutions of civil society.
Yeah, really quick, I would say, I know this is simple-minded, but I have a sort of a two principles in mind when I'm out there communicating, Latinos, non-Latinos, whatever. One is I care. Two is our ideas work. They sound simple, but it's fundamental. You have to relate to people. How are our policies making life better for you? And have they been proven in the past to work? And that I think that's, in a nutshell, I think what I try to put forth in digital content and communicating. I think sometimes we just overcomplicate things. Numbers especially, they're stats, right? And they get lost. But if you put a face to it, that little child that was crying on Time magazine, good God, so people are just like, how do you allow this to happen? Because you put a face to it. Because then you relate in a very human way. So we care and our ideas work.
Okay, we have, my dean has told me 5 minutes. We have 8 minutes from my perspective. So keep that in mind as you ask the question. Someone over here has the microphone, yes.
Yeah, so, is this on?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. So I think you actually may have addressed a little bit of this in what you were just saying, but I was just thinking, listening to all of this, I think it's interesting and these ideas are very appealing, but I also think it's kind of overlooking just the generational factors that are at play here. I mean, we have economic shifts that are unprecedented. Automation is taking away a lot of jobs. Centralization is a force to be reckoned with. And in a lot of ways, it's an exogenous force. It's not a part of these global elites or globalism that's like a conscious decision, a conscious effort. These are trends that are coming by as a result of technological advancement, communications technology, social media. A lot of these different factors are at play here. And I like some of the smaller solutions, like you were saying, and I hate to keep bringing up this example because I think it's a good one, but the answer can't just be like start a local t-ball team, because those exogenous factors will still be there. And I'm concerned that if we're constantly going back to de Tocqueville or to like 1950s social institutions, that we're going to be missing an opportunity to extend some of our ideas into the future and to try to build on them. So that's open to anyone for response.
But in a way, you've proved my point. You've proved Tocqueville's point. What's the oscillation that we have? We believe on the one hand that we're incapable of doing anything because of these institutional factors. And on the other hand, we've got this radical personal freedom. That's exactly my point. That's exactly Tocqueville's point. The wager here that I'm placing on the table is we actually don't know the extent of our liberty. We oscillate back and forth in our lived experience between the sense of radical fatality and radical freedom. That's what we're living. If we actually want to renew the world, we have to somehow step beyond that pairing. And the Tocquevillian wager, and here I will insist that he is actually relevant for the future, because he's seeing exactly what we're doing right here. The Tocquevillian wager is we actually can build a new future by taking a risk. We don't know where it's going to go. There's no certainty. But we can actually do it. But what we're doing here is we're oscillating back and forth between, these institutional constraints and my radical Facebook freedom. That's the pathology.
We have one last question.
I've got good news and bad news. Hi, my name is Roxanne Hogue, and Joshua, I hate to tell you, but in your packet, they want you to go on Facebook and talk about this event.
Listen,
sorry.
I don't have control over that.
Just because if there's no picture, it didn't happen according to my kids. And Tim, I will say, I'll challenge you. I'm actually running for state assembly here in California, and this may be the first mailer, I think, that says, if you're not alone, because that's been my whole message. And my question for all of you is actually how much of the connection has sort of, and I think everyone here who's from California and certainly lives in LA will get that we're sort of unique in that I'm not going to overstate it and say it's totalitarian, but I'm from Jamaica and I see where we've been trying to go, and I'm also an actor, and I know that we seeded two areas that are even bigger than universities. One is Hollywood, and one is K-12 education, and there's when you have no one on late night TV going like, well, I love the 4th of July, or hey, yeah, I stand for the flag. I mean, we're talking baseline sort of level of America's a good place, which I kind of believe because I stood in line to get here. No one doing that, and no one in schools, and my kids go to a very nice school, it's 40 grand a year per kid, and they don't say the Pledge of Allegiance anymore there. So how can we go forward having given up those two things, like having anyone that people can see, a teacher or a movie star, or even a sports star, and by the way, we do let sports stars, generally black ones, and I say that, thank God for their touchdown and their Super Bowl win, but nobody else.
Can I say something to that? I mean, in a way, I'm going to make the same point that I made with the neighborhood image, but it does seem to me that it's less important that a Hollywood celebrity or a figure in politics make these arguments than that somebody in a child's or a university student's life be there to make those arguments.
Because the corollary to that is they can't do it. They get so slapped down that I think we all have examples. We don't put bumper stickers on our cars or yard signs in our yards because you'll get physically accosted.
Right, but I guess my only point is that I do think those people are out there, but they're not praised, in the media, and they're doing their work in a kind of quiet and humble way, and we need to value those people for doing that.
As we end this session, I sense frustration. Many people want to speak and ask questions. That's exactly what we want, because the conversation continues, and I hope that you'll see connections not only with each other, but also with other panels. But I want to suggest to you that the generational question which you raise is an important one, but there's also an historical challenge. This has happened all the time. It happens over and over again through millennia that new technologies, new things change, and everything has changed in dramatic ways. And so that isn't the novel thing about us. Perhaps the novel thing about the generational divide now is that a generation does not seek to take ownership of its patrimony. It doesn't have the opportunities in the universities anymore to even know what it should be inherited and what made this civilization possible. It is an obsession with the experience of now and the unwillingness to examine the degree to which now is connected to that which came before. That is a very interesting generational question of our time. The one last question we have is whether we're a dry campus, and we're about to go eat, right, in a little bit. Is it possible to have community on a dry campus? It's something we've been testing for a long time here. Please do your best to have community on a dry campus. Do you have any announcements? Please thank our panelists.
I know they didn't sound like a vendor, but
No.
Are we having any fun? It's good. I'm really excited about how these two panels have kind of connected with each other. And again, I want to thank Dr. Brookhammer again for the first discussion. It really was meant to set a foundation, which has been built on here. And we'll continue through the evening and obviously through tomorrow and into Friday. And I hope you all can stay with us as much as you can. I know we have about 140 or 150 people registered for this, and I know that over the next couple of days they're going to kind of be coming and going. But I'm so glad that for you here, you are able to see and hear the first two panels, because they really do set the foundation for what's to come. So we are going to break for 45 minutes. We will gather in the executive dining room at 6:30, which you will see the signs, but it's right out the Goldsway patio and to your left. And in this time, I just want to encourage, I didn't think about this when we were planning this out, but if you have not been to the Heroes Garden, it is on a point overlooking the back left corner. And as someone who was in New York on 9/11, now to be at a university that I think both celebrates the sacrifice and memorializes that day more than I think any school west of the Mississippi, to be sure, is one of the many full circles in my life. And I thought it's particularly poignant that you do so now, That Heroes Garden is actually dedicated to a Pepperdine alum named Thomas Burnett, who was on Flight 93 and was one of the passengers, we understood, who teamed together with complete strangers to try to set a wrong right. And in so doing, obviously, they all lost their lives in trying to do that together. Complete strangers in the beginning, thrown together in this just amazing act of sacrifice. And so I hope you get a chance to do that. Again, it's just outside, and as you head out towards the left, we have an annual 9/11 memorial ceremony here. And it so happens that one of Burnett's daughters is a junior here at Pepperdine and gave the invocation at that service this past September 11th. And just an amazing ceremony. So we will regather again at 6:30. Dr. Victor Davis Hanson will be speaking. The title of his talk is Trump, Symptom or Catalyst. Again, I hope you're having a good time, but I know it's also drinking from a fire hose. At least that's, and I say this as an organizer of this. So please relax, find some time to connect with the panelists, either out back. We do have some refreshments there, and again, we'll reconvene over at the executive dining room at 6:30. Thanks so much.